welcome everybody. I am pleased to introduce our guest speaker for the Computational Social Science seminar series today, Professor Brian Uzzi. He is the Richard L. Thomas Professor of Leadership at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University and co-director of the Northwestern Institute on Complex Systems. His research spans a broad range of topics from the science of science, team collaborations, network science, and social network analysis. His works are cited across a broad array of academic disciplines, and personally, his work has also informed a lot of my work as well. And one core theme that I sort of found in many of his works is about moderation, or I sometimes call it the inverted U-shape. So there's this complementarity or delicate harmony of opposite elements in network structures that affect performance and success in many different areas, from firm survival to productivity of creative industries and to scientific innovation as well. He's a great teacher, and when I last checked your CV, receiving teaching awards almost every year, he is the recipient of the Euler Award from the Network Science Society, and just a great communicator and a delightful to listen to his talks. So without further ado, I turn the stage to Professor Brian Uzzi.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Really a pleasure and an honor to be here. This is like such a famous school. It really feels great to be here, and thank you for inviting me. I'm going to talk about two things today, and they're going to be on the subject we're all familiar with because we're all part of the subject, and that's science. And I'd like to talk about two computational pieces of research that I've done to help improve innovation in science. One is going to be to solve a problem we currently have in science that people have been knocking on the door of for the last 10 years and haven't been able to find a suitable solution. And that's going to deal with the replication problem in science. Why are so many papers in science failing? And I'm not going to get into the reasons why they're failing so much as trying to help us understand when our papers might fail, get feedback on that, and improve them so that they will not fail replication. So that's going to be one topic. And that's really about thinking about the side on the production side of innovation, because we all want to come up with good ideas. The second piece that I'm going to talk about is going to be on the output side of innovation, which is, okay, you've come up with a great idea. How do you go about showing the merits of your good ideas to others? Because no matter how great an innovation is, if you can't show people its merits, it goes nowhere. So I'm hoping that by the time you leave here today, you'll learn something about replication and ways in which we can begin to address this problem, and better ways to get other people to see the merits of your good ideas. So we'll talk about two things: boosting scientific innovation, discovering replication problems in science, and then I want to talk about effectively communicating your innovative ideas to other people. I'm going to start with the one that's looking at the production side of science, things that come up with generative ideas and innovation in science, and making sure that those are good and strong. I want to acknowledge my co-authors on this piece of research. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the replication problem, it looks something like this. Recent study in Nature asked scientists about replication problems in their field. The results were really pretty sobering. Turns out that the majority of scientists that they surveyed were losing faith in the replicability of work in their particular area, and that they were increasingly looking for ways in which to know whether their work might replicate or not. I'm going to talk about two papers that are related to this. I'm going to talk about this one that came out a couple of years ago that lays the basis for getting some sense of how much irreplicability is going on in science. So let's talk about just some of the background on this to bring you up to speed if you're not familiar with it. So the landmark study took place in 2015 It was called RPP. And basically what they did is they got a sample of 100 papers in psychology. They then went to the authors of those papers and they said, can you please share with us what your methodology was for your research? And then they tried to replicate those 100 studies using exactly the same design as the original researchers, but with new subjects. And what they found was the following: 61% of those papers failed. All 100 papers were from the top journal in psychology. After that happened and got published, people in economics and biology, particularly medicine, began to do some of the same kinds of studies. They also found a failure rate of over half the papers. Another problem that came out of this area was that it turns out that we, as consumers of research, once it's in the journals, seem to have a very hard time knowing whether it's a fact or a fluke. We went back to the 100 papers that were used in the original RPP study, and we looked at their diffusion through the literature. And what we found was this. You've got papers that fail in red, papers that pass replication in blue, and basically direct citations to failed or successfully replicated papers were the same, which means the literature is getting as much fluke results as fact results, because we as consumers can't detect that. And if you look at second-degree citations, you're finding the same things going on. So the literature which we rely upon is being hurt by these non-replicating papers. There was a paper done by a set of economists. Driba led that, it appeared in PNAS, and basically they estimated that the cost of failure to replicate in science is about $10 billion a year, which is a quarter of the NIH's annual budget. It's weakened job market for psychology PhDs. I see it at my own school. If a psychology PhD comes in and gives a job talk, economists and others in the room all start asking about replication. Did you check for replication? Did you redo your study? Because people have become aware of this. Undermines trust in science, obviously, as the Nature survey is shown. And then finally, DARPA got so concerned with this that 4 years ago, they put out a grant, $7.5 million to study replication. It's called the SCORE grant. Now, what's the background on all of this? How did we get here? Well, the first place that people looked was at peer review. And why isn't peer review a good filter for things that don't replicate? Turns out that peer review was never meant to catch papers that don't replicate. I don't know how familiar you are with peer review, but I did a history on it. It was invented by this guy, William Whewell. And why did he invent it? Well, it turns out that the British journal Philosophical Transactions couldn't get scientists to submit their papers to the journal. They thought it was a waste of time. So he came up with this thing called peer review, where he guaranteed to any scientist who submitted their paper that at least 3 people would read their paper. And those were the reviewers. That was a very humble beginning. And now, of course, peer review has grown and is a lot more involved in analyzing scientific papers. But from there, people have begun to look at papers that replicate and don't replicate. And the first place they look is at what they believe reviewers are looking at. That is kind of the statistics of the paper. So what's the p-value of the result? What's the effect size? How big is the n? And these are all correlations that have been produced by other researchers, not us. But basically what you can see here is that those statistics tend not to be very diagnostic of whether a paper will or will not replicate. So the very thing that we're trained on, when I went to graduate school and we were asked to review papers and learn how to do it, we were told to look at the statistics, but it turns out that statistics aren't very diagnostic, so it's not going to really help us with this problem. The literature has evolved again, and people have tried to come up with 2 main fixes. One is to come up with some new fancier, more sensitive statistics called p-star. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this. They are, in fact, more stringent measures of statistical relationships, but they have not been adopted very well, particularly in experimental sciences. Why? Because in experimental sciences, basically most of the thought goes into the design. And if you have the design right, you don't really worry so much about the statistics. So it hasn't been adopted, even though it has a potential to help us. The other thing that's been done is something called a prediction market. Again, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but the way the prediction market works is researchers get 100 papers that they choose from the literature, and then they get 100 researchers, and they ask those 100 researchers to bet on whether each of those 100 papers will replicate in a future manual replication. You're given $100 as a participant in the market, and depending on how much money you allocate to each paper's replicability gives you a way of coming up with a prediction. This tends to be the gold standard today of replication failure. It's right about 70% of the time, which is much better than 3 reviewers can get to. The problem with prediction markets is super expensive, takes a long time, and because you're looking at papers that are already in the literature, you go back to the previous slide, which means that those papers are already diffusing through the literature before the prediction market ever catches up with it. So what we decided to do was to see if we could use computational methods, particularly a single level neural network, to help us predict whether papers will replicate or not. And that's what brings me to this study. And what we're going to do is we're going to train a machine learning model on papers that replicate or don't replicate, and then we're going to ask it to predict a whole bunch of out-of-sample studies of also manually replicated papers, which is kind of our ground truth in this situation, to see if it's able to do predictions that are informative of whether the paper will replicate or not. The other thing we're going to do is we're going to look principally at just the narrative of the paper. Why? Because we already know that the statistics really aren't very diagnostic. So even if you put the statistics into a more sophisticated prediction model, they probably don't have the juice that's going to help you. The other thing is that most scientific papers are predominantly words. An average 5,000 word scientific paper has 5 to 6 statistics in it. Everything else is words. And all those words are often crafted in a way to help the reader think about how to interpret the statistics that follow it in the paper. So our minds are already being conditioned to think about potentially the replication of a paper, or scientists are writing in ways to manage their relationships with the words in the paper. So we're going to look at just the narrative, but we will also include the other statistics just to look at the differences, semantic relationships. Some scientific papers are basically text. So what did we do? Very quickly, and then I get into the results because I also want to show you the second paper. We start with a training set to create a foundational model of relationships among words in scientific papers. To do this, we went to 2 million abstracts present in Microsoft Academic Grant, which is today called OpenAlex, and we used that to train a foundational model. That is simply a map of the relationship between words, kind of co-occurrences of words in scientific texts. That's what we did there. Second step is we went to a training set where we had ground truth data on the original 100 papers that were put through manual replication, of which 60% failed, 40% did not fail. And we used this to fine-tune. We then went one step more. Fine-tuning, it used word2vec, so we're looking at co-occurrences of words, 5 before, 5 after each word in each text. This is not the most sophisticated method. I totally agree with you on that. But here was our thinking. We were not principally talking to computer scientists. We were trying to talk to scientists outside computer science. And we needed to go with a method that was functional but transparent, of which word2vec really performs that role for us. Word2vec has also been shown to be good in relatively small training samples relative to things like doc2vec. So that was our thinking here. And then here is basically our training sample. Granted, it's just 100 papers. We know that that's not a lot. But what we're putting the proof of the pudding is in how well it predicts out-of-sample papers. So we're going to start here, and then we move past that in the next study. But this is where we had to start because this was all that was available to us. So We then test the accuracy in out of sample. What do our out of sample data sets look like? Everything else from row 2 to row 11 are also manually replicated papers for which we know the ground truth. Did the paper pass or fail manual replication tests? And you've got quite a lot of diversity here in terms of the tests. So the training set was psychology and cognitive psychology, of which some of the testing sets are also cognitive and social, but we also have 2 data sets that are from economics to see whether the training here gives us any predictive utility in not only out of sample, but in another discipline that also uses psychology-like tests. So what we're doing is we're training, and then we're going to go to the test and see how we do. So what did we find out? Predictive utility. It turns out that the text is in fact more predictive of whether a paper replicates or not than the statistics, even when you put both things through separate machine learning models. So here's a way to see this. These are AUCs. Stats alone give you an AUC of about 0.67. Stats plus text is about 0.75, real significant bump. But if you just use the text, you're at 0.72. Pretty close to text and stats. This was us just looking at the cross-validation within the training set. We then said, okay, so let's see, we've got this model. Now let's apply it to the out-of-sample tests. How does the model perform? And again, what we've got now back of our mind is the gold standard is 0.7 for prediction markets. And if the machine could do that well or better, you've got something that's pretty valuable, because a prediction market is super expensive and it takes a year to run. So we did this. And then we went to look at how the test sets did. So now we're looking at rows 2 through 11. And what we find is we get pretty good AUCs in data that the model has never, ever looked at before. So when we looked at experiments using cognitive and social psychology that we were trained on, across that we get an AUC of 0.74. We're already feeling pretty good about this because we're over that 0.7 threshold of the prediction market. We then looked at just cognitive psychology, we do a little bit better, and in economics, we do a little bit worse, which is partly to be expected because although economists use experiments like psychologists do, they do use different language, particularly language of incentives and other things like that that doesn't appear. Nonetheless, this is still doing pretty close to the prediction market. So our out-of-sample tests wind up bringing us to over 200 studies, ground truth studies, which was all that was available on the planet when we did this particular study. Once we did this, we decided to actually do a toe-to-toe test. What we did is we went back to all the studies that had gone through a prediction market. We knew exactly the prediction market predictions, whether they were right or wrong, and we're going to go toe-to-toe with the machine against the prediction market. So this was going to be our most stringent test. And here's what we found. We're going to look at top K accuracy so that we have a sense of how confident the machine is, as well as its prediction. Now, let me share with you how to think about this, if you haven't seen graphs like this. So here are the 100 studies that go through the prediction markets, study 1 through study 100. And over here is replication likelihood that it'll replicate based on the confidence that the model gives you. So in a prediction market and in the machine learning model, it says, yes, I think the paper is going to replicate and I'm 90% sure. Or it says, I think the paper is going to replicate, but I'm only 70% sure. Okay? But you also get that with the prediction market. So what you'd like when you look at any of this is you'd like the ones where the model is almost 100% sure, you'd like them to be right 100% of the time. So what we did is we plotted 3 things. We plot the prediction market, which is the
light colors.
I'm sorry, the light colors, thank you. The prediction market is the light colors, and the machine is the dark colors. Blue means you're right, red means you're wrong. And then we got something else. Just before we went to publish this, someone decided to do a survey of the same 100 papers to look at like just basic crowd wisdom of other scientists, no betting. So we decided to put that in. Now, what does the machine do? The machine does pretty well for us. If you look at the top 10% of most confident predictions, the machine, the prediction market, and the survey are all doing basically the same level of accuracy. Just to give you a sense, this prediction market to complete was about 18 months, 100 faculties' time in the prediction market. We run the 100 studies through the machine and get similar level of accuracy in essentially a few hours. If you look down at the bottom part, where it's least likely to where its accuracy is lower, the prediction market and the machine are actually really pretty close. So the machine toe-to-toe is giving us a way to think about replication and replication failure in a new way that's more cost-effective, but also quite informative. It can also be used as a self-diagnostic test, because we've created a website where scientists could go, submit their paper, get feedback from us, and it may say to them, hey, the model's not confident that it will replicate. Now, why would we do a thing like that? Because we also went into the qualitative data on replication. And it's really pretty interesting. They go to scientists and they say to them, you know, look, your paper failed replication. Did you have any sense that it wasn't going to pass replication? And the scientists would say things like, you know, the day we ran the study, it was raining out and the subject sat in the experiment soaking wet. Maybe that was enough to make results something that's not going to work outside in a condition where they're not sitting there soaking wet and shivering. We also, you also get qualitative feedback a lot in medicine, where, for instance, they say, you know, the sample was left out 15 minutes longer than it should have been. We had a slight power failure one day. We thought everything would be okay. So what the idea here is that if you find that your study's not replicating, it may be a cue to you, based on the machine's feedback, to go in and double check the things that you're doing before you submit it. So this is where we left off with this study. Then what we wanted to do, we says, okay, so now we've got this machine, let's go out and look at an entire field of papers and get estimates on the entire field's replicability. Why? Because if you're dealing with only a few papers, you really wonder how much does it generalize or not. So we thought the machine could give us a way to look at that. That brought us to study number 2. It really revolves a lot around 2 individuals. Danny Kahneman, Nobel Prize winner in economics, but a psychologist. He's famous for a lot of behavioral science stuff like anchoring and adjustment, availability bias. Maybe you've heard about these things. And for him, he has always been very positive about replication failure. He thinks it's like making science stronger. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Replication crisis has been raising standards and improving methods in psychological science. Susan Fiske, also an extremely renowned psychologist, has really been on the other side of this whole debate about psychology and replication failure. She says individuals are finding their research, careers, and personal integrity under attack because failure in a few hundred studies that were put to manual replication is being blown out of proportion in psychology and hurting a lot of people's careers. So we looked at this and said, well, let's use our model to go into psychology and see if we could add some insight into just what is the scale and the scope of failure in psychology. So here's what we did. We went back to the last 20 years of psychology. We went to their top 7 journals, and we downloaded all 14,000 papers that were published. That includes 25,000 authors, 6,000 institutions, 1 million plus citations, 27,000 media mentions, and last 20 years of data, and in basically what's called the big 6 fields in psychology. We're then going to take those papers, take out all their text, and we're then going to use the model to estimate failure of replicability across the field. Before we do that, though, we're now going to further train our model, not just on the 100 papers, but we're now going to train it on the original 100 papers plus the sample of testing data that we had. So now it's trained on 300, not just 96. And I'm going to share with you just a few things that wound up being most important in this study to people in the field of psychology. They wanted to know how much does failure vary by subfield. So there had been a very long discussion of whether like developmental psychology was kind of the runt of psychology. Like it just couldn't keep up with cognitive psychology. It didn't have as good a method, so on and so forth. Experimental versus observational methods. Why? Because psychology's bread and butter, quite frankly, is experimental work. It tells us causality. And so how does experimental do versus observational data? And then things unlike author experience, impact, and prestige, and other things are being looked at in the media. So what did we find here? Let's take a look at these results, and then we'll go on to think about how do you communicate good results. So it turns out that replicability, according to our model, varies quite a lot by subfield. Here is basically the distributions across the 6 fields. This is increasing replicability. So of all the fields, personality psychology replicates the best. And this was consistent with what surveys had gotten from people in psychology. The lowest turned out also to be developmental psychology. So why developmental psychology? Developmental psychology does have problems with replication in a couple of ways. It's not undeserving. One is they tend to follow people over very long periods of time, which means it's harder to control external factors. People drop out of the experiments over time. A lot of development psychology deals with children in developmental phases, which means that lots of changes could happen later on because you're at a formative stage, not a stable stage. And developmental psychology, to its credit, often does try to look at unrepresented communities. So we don't have as much data. Personality psychology tends to do better where it's an area in psychology, interesting enough, that doesn't do a lot of experiments. It's mostly survey work. So if we then look at experiments versus observational work, one of the things that came out across all 6 of the big 6 fields is experimental work significantly fails to replicate more than observational work. So in psychology, this kind of shook them up because they believe that this is really the best thing to do. But in fact, it's the stuff that fails the most. And that fails the most across all areas. Why is one of the biggest questions right now in psychology about what it is that makes experiments fail. There is a paper coming out next month or so in Psych Science that used our model, found the same thing, and then is trying to figure out why experiments fail. So we'll see what they came up with. Let's talk about one last piece, and then I'm trying to finish in an hour. But if you have questions, do interrupt me. Yeah, please.
So I'm wondering, with this method, and you said it was an easy method, and as a kind of social scientist for me to understand, so I appreciate that.
Yes.
The word DVEC. It seems like it would pick up kind of latent socialization. That's kind of partly what it's picking up in a sense. And so I wonder if you layer on networks of co-authors or kind of advisors and this type of thing, if that would help the prediction at all, right? So am I understanding, because partly is a question about the method. If you're picking up kind of the use of words in a similar way, I'm wondering if that's also what you're picking up as kind of a socialization of ways of doing research and
So what you're saying is, maybe in the background, what we're finding is one of the things that is influencing whether a paper replicates or not is if you're part of potentially a network that's looking at the world in the wrong way or is overlooking important markers of problems.
Yeah, and like Susan is trying to point out, right? I mean, I think we're always, when we see the lack of replicability, I think a lot of people, partly influenced by the media, start to think then, oh, there's fraud or there's something shady going on, or at least not being careful enough, right? And so I'm just wondering if it's part of it is a training issue of as they get socialized and they're part of some community that they then take certain shortcuts, let's not talk about fraud for a second, but just take certain shortcuts that make them less careful, make it less likely to be replicable.
So let me say, I think it's a good hypothesis. And we are currently, as our next extension of this, trying to find different ways to measure those network relationships. So one would be co-authorship relationships. One would be co-citation relationships. Another could be semantic relationships. So we've taken everything that we've done here, and now we've put the papers into DocDevec, which gives us relationships among papers in a summary form. So like the relationship could be co-authors, it could be co-citations, it could be co-institutions, all that kind of becomes just one link in the DocDevec. So we're looking at that now, but we didn't do it for this work.
Yeah.
So I think that could be an important
part of what's going on.
part to look at.
I mean, I guess I'm asking kind of, is that what WordDevec is kind of doing in some ways? Can I think about that as like socialization in the sense that we're using similar words?
Yeah, so let me just say one thing about why we needed to take some more time to look at this. One of my colleagues, James Evans, tried to directly measure co-authorship relationships and failure to replicate. And so when you first do that, you kind of use like your typical network measures. So how clustered is the group? What, are they brokers between communities? And he basically finds nothing. And the reason is sometimes cohesion in a community could be because they really hold very high standards.
Sure.
Cohesion in a community could also be that they hold poor standards. So if you're just looking at that without like knowing like the intrapsychic standards, you kind of get, you don't have a place to go unless you collect some more information. And that's what we're hoping to do in another stage, but thanks for the question. Please, John.
Super interesting. There seems to be an acceptance that when replication fails, that the people doing the replication are doing good work. I question that because the effort to get a paper published is hard, but it's not clear that the replication effort is as hard. And it also seems to assume that replication is consistently difficult, but I think like what you were showing with psych is it's totally not. Some things are just a lot harder. So I'm wondering, like when you look at your prediction of failure to replicate, if you're actually really just modeling difficulty of replication, not, so being that the more difficult it is to execute a study, the greater likelihood you won't be able to replicate.
So that's an interesting, I've never heard that before. That's an interesting approach on this. And I suppose it can be looked at. If you went back to all the manual replications and you had someone take the design and rate it for its difficulty, you might find that there's a correlation between failure to replicate and the difficulty of going through the motions of replicating. I have not done that, but that might be a way.
Well, just like with your look at developmental psychology, it's just like recruiting those participants so much harder than the personality, right? Like your two ends of the continuum.
Yes.
I'm just thinking, just the recruiting part, those are totally opposite.
Yeah, yeah. So there's probably some signal there just in what we've shown. But that could also be the case. So we've got a selection issue that may be going on with the replication. Please.
Right. Oh,
Great. It was interesting for me how abstract can be, the text from abstract can be that powerful for predicting the replicability of a paper. I'm curious, have you ever thought about using papers with code as a ground truth?
Papers.
Papers with code.
Code.
Yeah, it's a database that if you have a GitHub URL for your project, for your paper, it appears there automatically. And it's a sort of community driven that people reproduce your
Yes.
project.
Yes.
That might be interesting to have a look if you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In fact, you remember the DARPA grant I talked about?
Yeah.
So there's a piece of that for replication, which is what I'm talking about, and then a piece for reproducibility. I don't mean to confuse you with these terms if that's what's happening, but they consider two different things. So if you take someone's code and you see, can you run it again and get the same outcome? Or you run it again with a slight change in specification of the model, do you get the same outcome? That's usually called reproducibility. So there are groups that do that. Also, I don't mean to, if I misspoke, the model isn't looking at just the abstract of the paper. The abstracts we use to create the foundational model of the association among words in scientific texts. But what we send through the model is the text of the paper.
The full text.
Yes.
And the last thing.
Except for the references.
Have you ever thought about using large language models to see how they perceive?
Yeah, it sucks. Yeah, it's like all over the place. Some of it is not diagnostic at all. And sometimes it comes back and says, it's not my job to tell you if the paper can replicate or not. I'm totally serious. Yeah. Or this is what we think, but don't trust us. So we did in fact try to do that, and it just didn't work. They're not there yet. One thing I will say on this topic is for large language models, they're becoming more and more specific for different things. Large language model for a literature review, some of this stuff with Dashun. A model that could be formulated for replication analysis could be a really great breakthrough for science. How you would train it and do we have enough data, I think is the barrier. That's one of the things that I've been trying to think about. I thought I saw another hand up here. Please.
Yeah, with respect to using the 2 million abstracts for the initial training set, how delicate is the assumption that the use of language in an abstract is a good proxy for use of language in the paper as a whole? I ask because abstracts tend to be stylized and to carry less detail than the body of the paper. So it strikes me that that's an assumption worth looking at.
Yeah, and I would agree with you. We didn't actually do any kind of measurement to see, the mapping of one to the other, the transfer learning, if you will. We didn't do that. But we did have some of those concerns. So one of the things is, in cognitive psychology, they sometimes put numbers in the abstract, talking about different neurons and things like this. So we did try to incorporate some of that into the learning. But that would be another thing to look at. Okay, so let's talk about the last thing, and then I want to talk about promotional language. So what did we find out? We find out that experimental work fails a lot in psychology, much more than non-experimental work, which kind of shook the field, and that it varies by area. What did we find about other kind of markers, labels in papers that could help us? So university rank, whether you're from, top ranked university or not, no difference in whether paper's likely to fail or not, based on our estimate of the 14,000.
This is just psych papers?
It's just psych papers. So there was an argument that, people at the top schools are going to replicate more than people at the schools that aren't top schools because the top schools have the top researchers. Turns out there's no difference. I think that's a great result for us. The research's impact in terms of productivity and citations. Turns out that people who publish more and people who are more highly cited are more likely to replicate. So potentially that again has something to do maybe with skill that isn't picked up at the university level. Productivity, I just mentioned that again, also positively related to things replicating. Citations, in a training sample, there was no difference, but in a predicted sample, there was. The citations of the authors, the group of authors, more citations, more likely to replicate. But the one thing that was in the opposite direction was media coverage. And it was strong. You're much less likely to replicate if you're covered in the media. And this is including New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and social media. I'm not entirely sure why this is, but in my time presenting this to psychologists and to in social media contexts, many people explain this as it's the cutesiest findings that get picked up in psychology by the media. And the cutesiest findings may be the ones that are least likely to replicate. So like a couple of studies here that got picked up was the researchers had people sit for the GRE, and they had the control group sit in their normal clothing, but the experimental group wore a white lab coat like a scientist. And they did better on the GRE than the experimental group. That got a lot of press. The assumption being somehow if we think we're smarter or we feel smarter by the clothing we're wearing, we will be smarter. I remember when that study first came out, my daughter was taking the GRE. I'm like, Ella, I want you to wear this white law and do it. She says, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. So that might explain some of this, but again, that's for more digging into in terms of what's going on. What are we doing next? Well, we're going to do some of the things. I'm sorry I didn't know your name, but we're going to try to look at network relationships and other things that could help us. And in terms of what we found so far in terms of explanations, disciplines don't matter, journal format doesn't matter, research topic doesn't matter. The one thing that we have found consistently that the model uses for its prediction are n-grams. So what's an n-gram? An n-gram is a co-citation of words. An n-gram of two are how much two words show up together. So like in psychology, experiment and subject co-occur a lot. What we found was that the more unusual the n-grams are, the more likely the paper is to fail replication. Why? We're not entirely sure, but to us it feels like if you're using an unusual combination of words, maybe as an author, you're trying to find a way to explain a result that can't be explained in a straightforward way, and as a consequence, maybe you're putting words together in an unusual way to make it acceptable. We don't know because one of the drawbacks of these n-grams is that on their own, they're uninterpretable to just see three words next to each other. You have to go pretty deep into each paper to look up where those n-grams are coming from to draw your conclusion. We haven't done it, but this is one of the things that we found as things that the model's using to predict failure to replicate. So I'm going to skip this because I started a little late, didn't have time to get into this. This is us doing some of the same work with patents, if you will, and thinking about how scientific innovation has changed over time. And I'll just give you the bottom line on this. You're probably familiar with recently in science, people have been measuring that science's level of innovation has been dropping There's less disruptive papers. Carrier Advisor did some great work on this. And that kind of measures innovation in science as kind of like big disruptive ideas, single big disruptive ideas. What we did is we went into patents to kind of look at this disruption, and we found something we didn't expect, which is, from our point of view, it looks like science is switching innovation from one big idea that changes a lot of things to a kind of divide and conquer strategy. What science is doing instead is it's putting together relatively modest innovations, but when they work in parallel together, they solve really big problems. So here's an example, very quickly. Ultrasonic medical care is like a huge change in medical technology. You get to see inside the body, it's non-intrusive, and you could actually use it to in surgery and other ways to correct problems. If you look at how this technology works, however, you don't have like one big innovation like an X-ray machine. What you have is you've got separate pieces of the innovation that all work together. One company actually creates the sonic material. If you don't know how it works, what it does is it basically puts sound waves on your skin or just below your skin, which creates bubbles. Those bubbles tend to free the area to help it heal. That's kind of how it works. One company developed this, but that alone you can't do anything with. Why? Because you need something that's going to help you stabilize this product near the wound on the body. That's what this company did. Then you need something else that allows you to cut or manipulate the skin and cut it so that this and this can get to the wound. And then you need something else for specialized areas, like if you're doing something in the spine, to make it work with that part of the body. Then on top of all of that, you need a probe to know where you need to go. Again, this is from a completely different innovation, from a completely different company. And ultimately, you need something that's going to regulate the electricity coming out of the wall to keep it all very even. These cluster of innovations is what makes ultrasonic technology work so well in medicine. But no single innovation on its own is a big innovation like X-rays. So for us, science is still innovative, but it's changed how it's innovating. It's now kind of divide and conquering much bigger problems. And for me, that makes total sense. Why? Because look at how we're trained today. I mean, we're trained more and more and more and more narrowly in particular fields. We only see a small part of a problem and are only equipped to solve a small part of a problem. So having something that solves something in a comprehensive way is harder and harder for science, but putting things back together is a way to solve that problem. That's what we're doing, taking more of these methodologies. Now, I've got about 10 minutes to share with you a last piece of this. And this last piece is about, okay, you got the great idea. How do you get other people to see the merits of it? And this is going to take us into the world of promotional language. Some of you in the room might recognize Sophie. She graduated from this program. She's in the lab. She's been working on this. Sophie, by the way, has just been great. Thank you. So science of innovation, it's basically two things. You got to generate ideas, you got to communicate them. We know a lot about generating ideas, teams, funding, culture, mentorship, networks, I could go on. We actually know very little about the communication process and how scientists communicate their merits to other scientists. It's a complex problem, it's rarely researched, and I don't think it's even taught to help us understand how to do this. Semantics matter in a lot of ways in how you communicate things. Outside of science, people have looked at it in different contexts. I want to give you one example of how important communication can be. And it's going to be a race for the Nobel Prize. Two papers were published that basically introduced the world to CRISPR technology. If you don't know what CRISPR technology is, basically a way of going inside your body, cutting up your DNA, and putting it back together in new ways. It's like, wow, that's a big deal. The first person to write about this was this individual, and his paper gets submitted to Science and Nature, gets rejected at both places, and then sits at PNAS for almost 9 months. Another group, after he starts the process of getting CRISPR published, submits their paper to Science. It goes right in. This case has been studied by other people. The content of the two papers is almost identical. The only thing that differed was how the results were communicated to the journal and to the community. They go on to win the Nobel Prize, but he was first. Nonetheless, good things happened to him. Why? Because he wound up winning a prize when other people realized that he really deserved it. So he got $1 million, even though he was scooped for CRISPR. Now, most people who get scooped aren't going to get another prize. And what we want to do is we want to learn, how do you get great ideas out? Because his great idea was held back almost a year simply because of the way it was communicated to the journal and the editors. One way in which you do communication is with language. I'm going to focus on one type of language of communication that has recently caught the eye of a number of researchers. I want to talk about the written communication, and then I want to talk about our research question. So here's the research puzzle. Research starts with grants. So what we want to do is we want to look at the communication of good ideas in grants and see how what you would do in your communication process to increase your probability of getting the grant. Because if you don't get the grant, other things might not follow. We also care about, if you do get the money, do you go on to publish even more high impact research based on the communication process used to get the grant as a predictor of that. Very quickly, a computer scientist named Miller, who's in a University of Tokyo, he goes and he downloads 1 million funded NIH grants from the last 20 years. And he starts playing with language, he's looking at language, and what he finds out is that something called promotional words has had a meteoric rise over the period of 1985 to 2020. This meteoric rise, by the way, is not simply a change in the use of this language everywhere, but in these grants. This caught our attention. And one of the drawbacks of this research is he's only looking at funded grants. So you really don't know, you get this tremendous selection problem. So what we did is we worked to get a large sample of tens of thousands of grants that were both funded and unfunded to see if there's a relationship between promotional words and your grant success. So, give you a sense of what these promotional words look like. So here's a sentence. This is taken from Miller's work, his report. He says, is there a, oh, here you go. Further, a unique and key aspect. He sees these things as promotional words: imperative, advanced, fundamental, paramount, revolutionary, innovative, novel, essential, unique, unprecedented. How does he come to see these words as being promotional? He actually sits down with 3 coders. 3 coders review all 1 million grants. And they're just looking at their abstracts now. That's how they get through the million. And they're asked to pull out words that are having an effect on their cognition from their point of view, engaging them, things that make what they just read more memorable. And they start to include a list of what those words are. They then become cross-validated, does a bunch of other important validation techniques, and what he comes up with is a 139-word lexicon of these promotional words. We're going to use that lexicon. And again, what's going on here is that these words are thought to invoke in people a sense of originality of the ideas, significant ideas, engages memory. And that means in his implicit writing, if you've got P words, it's engaging cognition, which is going to lead to funding success because people are going to see the merits of your good ideas. We take this and then we go to the analysis. We're going to look at the relationship between the percentage of promotional words in a grant and whether the grant gets funded or not, whether the grant has inherent true novelty. So are these promotional words just like window dressing? Are they actually reflecting true innovativeness in the grant? And then we're going to look at the citation of the grants, papers that are published from that grant. So is it having an impact in the literature? We're going to look at 12,000 funded and unfunded grants. These grants come from the Novo Nordisk Foundation, which is one of the largest funders of scientific research in Europe, the NIH, and the NSF. The finding is promotional language is very predictive of success. It predicts funding, it predicts innovativeness, and citation impact. So this brings me to, well, what does it look like? So I'm not going to talk about this, but even though they validated the dictionary, we did a lot of other stuff to do our own validation, and it held up. So if you want to know more about this, do ask me a question, but I'd like to just get to the results because I'm just watching the clock. And we're going to look at these 139 promotional words. Here's just an example of some of them. Now, data and methods. Here is our data. Novo Nordisk Foundation, they're $120 billion a year in funding. They're big. They do mostly medical research. That's where the big numbers come from. We've got over 13,000 funded and unfunded grants from them. So I had the text of the funded and unfunded grants. Very unusual, actually, because most people whose grants don't get funded, they don't want anybody to look at that grant because maybe someone's going to steal their ideas. The NSF, we've got 585 grants from my own university that were de-identified, and at NIH, we've got about 3,000 from my own university also de-identified. We're going to add to this data set a lot of bibliographic data. So on the performance of these scholars, up until the point that they do the graphs, how much do they publish, what are their citations, what are the teams they work with, et cetera. And then we're going to do some computer experiments at the end, but I'm not going to bring that up now because it's just too much information. And here's basically what we're going to do. We're going to look at 3 outcome variables. Three. Funded or not, get you the first step. Is it window dressing or not? So the idea here is it an innovative idea or not? And is the grant innovative? And the citation impact. The way we're going to do it is we're going to put the grant into the machine. The machine is going to add up any place it sees one of the 139 words in the lexicon dictionary. And then we're going to create a simple variable, which is the percentage of promotional words relative to all the words in the grant. So it's all normalized. And then we're going to have a bunch of control variables. So we're going to use just a regression framework. We're just going to look at writing styles, like a Flesch score. 6 performance variables on each PI, citations, productivity, et cetera, prior to the grant. 4 grant characteristics. So, once you get into grants, it's like there's different kinds of grants. So there's like a grant for regular research funding, there's a developmental grant, there's a researcher, so on and on. So we're going to create grant characteristics that measure those things. We're going to look at the different programs that are in. Is it medicine, social science, engineering? We're going to use fixed effects and fixed effects. So we're trying to do everything we can in the regression to control for confounds. And then we're going to run the experiment. So what are our findings? So if I go back to here, what you need to keep in mind is, imagine this regression's being run with all these control variables. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a margins plot. You familiar with margins plots? So what a margin plot is, it's an econometric method. The regression gives you an estimate of two variables, the outcome variable and the independent variable, controlling for all the other variables in the regression. So if you're interested in one thing like percentage of promotional words, a margins plot is a great way to show the results of the regression analysis. So let's look at this. Here we have our first outcome. What is the relationship between the percentage of promotional words and your probability of being funded? The base rate for Novo grants of funding is 17%. So if I were to close my eyes and just reach into the bin of grants, 17 out of 100 I get right just by chance. What you can see here is that promotional words wind up increasing your ability to get the grant by about 3 over 17, which is like about 17% increase. Notice something else. If you use too few promotional words, you don't even reach the statistical base rate of getting the grant. So using too few is hurting you. Notice something else. Look at the scale here of percentage of promotional words. It goes from 2%. You're like, 2%? How's 2% going to affect me? But it turns out it's actually a lot if you do anything in language. The average is 1%. This is where most people are, and they're below the base rate. 1% translates to the following: a promotional word every 4 sentences. Now, if you look at the front end of the grant and the rear end of the grant, promotional words occur once every 3 sentences. They're there, and that's enough to have an effect in terms of people's memory and engagement. This is what we did with the Novo grants. We then went to replicate the results, and we did it with the NIH and the NSF grants. And what you can see, it's pretty similar relationship. Got more spread here, but of course we have much less data. Nonetheless, if you were to take this, no matter how you moved within the confidence intervals, you're still in a statistically beneficial place. Please.
The promotional words are all adjectives, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder if it makes sense to do adjectives per noun for these papers. Like, is it that, for example, I'm pitching work that's mostly done, and so I have more things to mention, or I'm pitching stuff that I will do, and I have to use more verbs to describe the process more than the deliverables?
Yeah. So good questions, and all those things could be calculated. We didn't find the proportion of nouns in a paper is proportional to the overall number of words. So we didn't break it down in that way. We could. I bet we'd find something pretty similar. And then we're going to do something else with these words at the end that maybe helps you see that even more clearly. So, findings. Guess what? Promotional words do help you communicate your ideas to others. Now, are the ideas meritorious or not? Because maybe it's just a bunch of window dressing and hype. We were worried about this. So what we did is we took a methodology that my lab had developed a few years ago to estimate the innovativeness or the novelty of a scientific paper. Basically, the way this works is it goes into the past and it looks at the combination of ideas that have been used historically. If ideas have been combined a lot historically, it's not considered innovative. It's now convention. People are used to seeing these ideas paired together. However, if you're pairing together ideas that haven't been paired together before, then that's novel. So what we did is we went to every grant and we calculated its novelty score. We then looked for what is the relationship between percentage of promotional words and the novelty of the paper. And here, just as a descriptive relationship, number of promotional words, novelty score, what you can see here is a strong positive relationship between increases in the novelty score and increases in promotional words. This is a bivariate relationship. Now let's throw it into that margins plot where we're controlling for everything else to deal with confounds. And what we do is, again, we find this, that the more promotional words you have, the more and more novelty the grant actually has. To me, this is very good news because it says that scientists aren't hyping their work. Scientists are using promotional words in proportion to how actually innovative it is, which is one of the things that promotional words are supposed to do. We then, almost done here, almost done. So, for instance, here's a metric. Grants with 2% promotional words are 54% more innovative than the average. So there's a real meaningful relationship here. Now, let's look at the papers that get published after the grant is funded. This is all going to be from the Novo Nordisk Foundation grant, so it's going to be that 13,000 grants, not the NIH and NSF. Why? Because Novo Nordisk keeps very close track of every paper that's published off their grant. So we have confirmed knowledge from them that these papers are related to the grants they funded. And we're going to look at two things: average citation impact, the max citation impact, and productivity. And in all three cases, those promotional words forecast how well the papers based on the funded grant will do out in the marketplace. Average citations, the more promotional words you have, the more average citation your papers have that are from the grant. You also have increase in having a max citation. The more promotional words, the more your best paper is high relative to all the other best papers in the data set. These are done from journal impact factors, not the actual citations. Why? Because our grants go all the way up to 2023, which means we can't really estimate how many citations they have, but journal impact factors are a good estimate of what the citations will be. Finally, we look at productivity. Productivity is significant, but I will be honest with you, it's a much weaker effect. If you kind of like draw a line from here to there, it could be flat, right? So it's statistically significant. We report it, but we also report that it is a weaker effect. And so you need to be careful in interpreting that. Now, this brings me to the last thing. What about mechanisms? Here's what we did. We went to each grant and we said, okay, for each promotional word, what would happen if we were to substitute that promotional word for a word with the same meaning, but it's neutral? So neutral synonyms. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to start with a certain expectation. Several papers have been published on grant review, and they find that positive sentiment or emotional engagement by a reviewer is positively correlated with the grant being funded. So what we did is we're going to go through our grants and we're going to do these substitution experiments. We're randomly going to replace promotional words with one of their neutral synonyms at 5% level, 10%, 50%, 20%. So we go into the grants and we're going to take out 5% at random of all their promotional words and replace those promotional words with neutral synonyms. Neutral synonyms come from the Oxford Dictionary. Those neutral synonyms are about 1,500 for all 139 promotional words. So what we do is we don't just substitute it once. At 5%, every grant gets substituted every word 100 times. So that now we take the average across all of this to make sure we're not being influenced by outliers. And we repeat it 100 times for each proposal. We compare cognitive level activation score before and after replacement. When we do that, we do something like this. We start with our original sentence, unique and key. They're both promotional words. We replace unique with specific, one of its neutral synonyms. And we replace key with central, also a neutral synonym. And then we look to see what happens. And the way to look at this is percentage of proposals that have lower cognitive engagement, depending on how many promotional words are substituted. So if you substitute 25% of your promotional words with neutral synonyms, 61% have a drop in their cognitive activation score. So this is estimates using computational techniques that are supposed to model how human beings would react to the grant had the grant had fewer promotional words in it. So it's just an estimate. We don't know if this is really happening, but it's just an estimate of what we think is happening. Nonetheless, it gives us some sense that this might be something that you'd want to recreate in a real experiment with human beings. We couldn't do it because we've got 13,000 grants, too hard to do. So it's one way to begin to think about what's going on with these promotional words that is at least consistent with what theory would say. Finally, last thing I want to leave you with. What are some of the things about a grant and its PIs that are associated with the percentage of promotional words going up? So we go back to our modeling, and now we're going to do a structural equation model. It's kind of like a path diagram. So here's kind of interesting when you look at it. If you look at the number of prior funding applications from a PI, the more a PI submits a grant, the next time they have more promotional words in it. If they've been successful in the past, they put more promotional words in it next time. That also leads to more funding, and when people ask for more funding, when they ask for more funding, they're also putting more promotional words in. Something very interesting up here, without going into all the details, other research has shown that men receive grants more frequently than do women, holding constant the quality of the grants. What we're finding here is, though, that one of the ways to lessen that inequality is when women use promotional language. So one of the benefits of promotional language could be in making science more inclusive. Finally, publications, citations also lead to more requested funding, and this is driving percentage of promotional words. Lot to think about here in your own work and how you might use this to help you out. Here's a few closing thoughts. So, we care a lot about innovation in science. I mean, that's what makes science what it is. It's all about innovation. There's two things about innovation. One is about coming up with ideas and making sure they're solid. That's what we worked on with replication. And another is really being able to communicate the merits of your good ideas to others. We've looked at one way of thinking about this with promotional language, and we find that promotional language is related to communicating that to others in terms of getting grants, actually having grants that are innovative and future citation impact. We've tried to do everything we can in terms of controlling for confounds, and we've looked at 3 different agencies, which allows us to even replicate the results of promotional language across agencies that have different groups of people asking for money, that have different institutional structures for making their decisions and different pots of money, and it holds across all 3. And the possible mechanism for this has to do with cognitive engagement and attention. With that, I'll stop here. I know it's almost 12. Happy to stick around for questions or take questions now, but I want to thank everyone very, very much for inviting me here today. It's really been a pleasure. Thank you. Yeah.
I had a question. So I have a short, cute question and then a serious question, which is, you pointed to some PNAS stuff to motivate your replication work, but Susan Fisk wasn't an editor on those things. I wonder if you ever get feedback from Susan since you're engaging with PNAS.
It's true. Susie was not an editor on that. I have not gotten feedback from her, but I did give a talk at Columbia University.
Okay.
And one of her students was in the audience. And if his feedback to me reflects her feedback to me, I'm not sure she likes the work.
And then the other question was, it seemed like you were comparing the performance of predicting replicability compared to ranking the replicability score. And it looked like the survey method did well for the studies with low replicability score, right? And better than the other methods for the, I would guess the studies we would want to catch the most, right? So how to interpret that? The other thing is these studies were picked up by the survey, but survived peer review. I assume all the studies were peer reviewed and published. And so like why did they get picked up in the survey of experts, but not during peer review as a potential issue?
Yeah, so the survey of experts was also 100 experts.
As opposed to 3 reviewers.
As for which they take the average of. So I think, having 100 people look at it is going to give you a more accurate score than just 3 for, a lot of sampling reasons. So I think that's why it picked up on it. In terms of the bottom part of that distribution, the survey for the lowest 10% of confidence, the survey was right 100% of the time. Prediction market was also right 100% of the time. Machine was 90%.
Yeah.
So they were pretty close there. On the upper end, they were all the same. Now, the survey's got its other problems. People don't like to spend the time.
Yeah.
The other thing is you're only getting responses from people actually interested enough to look at the papers to give you a response. So we don't know about that either. So surveys have a value, but there's still a lot of questions about what are we learning from them if we were to try to use surveys with a lot of stuff.
Were they paid to participate in the survey?
To be honest with you, I don't remember. And there's only been just that one survey. The score, 7.5 million, that team led by Brian Nosek, they have been trying to do more surveys to a broader range. So we'll hopefully have some more information about that. Yes?
Did your first study include either in the language model or as like another thing you've thought about pre-registration? Like does that have, is that something that shows up like in abstracts in any way? Like is the term or as a control of like, oh, is pre-registration actually improving the science or is it just another sort of feature?
So we didn't have enough pre-registrated studies to know. And the original RPP occurs before people cared about pre-registration. And then our big 14,000 kind of census also includes years that, most of the years prior to pre-registration. I'm not entirely sure, I just anecdotally, I hear mixed responses from psychologists about pre-registration and whether it actually is increasing replication or not.
You could just empirically, you could use it as a little bit of a shock to see about
Change when it
to see if change in your method, if it does anything. Or,
Yeah, that would be interesting. The issue,
to be fair, it has been adopted gradually.
yeah,
Especially outside of social psych, maybe it was more adopted more quickly there, but like sociologists, we've only started to really do it.
and I would say that's one of the things that I would worry about.
Yeah.
The adoption's been slow. It hasn't been like a discrete change in law or rules. The other thing is that pre-registration comes online, so to speak, at a time when people are already caring a lot about replication.
Yeah.
So it could just be,
Both, there's
both
both things.
things. Yeah, Patrick.
In this period of combinatorial innovations, I'd like to think about the 2 studies that you presented today. So what would you predict will happen if you try to predict replicability with the P words in the grants?
Well, if P words are picking up on what we know, P words pick up on more novelty, right? So they're positively correlated with novelty. Also positively correlated with publication and citations. I don't know, if I felt like maybe this is what the answer I could give you. If I thought that promotional words were being used by scientists as hype, just to kind of like keep it simple, then I would worry that, it's gonna be related to replication failure. But it doesn't seem to be related to hype. So I think that they're being as careful as anybody else would be, so maybe there's no relationship at all.
Right. So if a study is truly innovative and something new, then the probability that it won't hold will probably be also higher. And so then if the keywords are like a true or very, a good measure of innovativeness and novelty, then the replication failures would they also be?
Well, I hadn't thought about that, but you probably, that could be another way in which you could go. I suppose we could look at it. I'll let you know. We'll run it. Okay. Thanks. Good idea. Yes, please.
I had a thought. So now that we're in this room, we know about this. It would be a bad thing for us to keep adding promotional language to words to our grants, even if we're not sure how innovative our work actually is.
Well, we were talking of one of the reviewers for the promotional words. It's its second round right now. Well, we've got our fingers crossed. Was very straightforward and said, I don't think this paper should be published because it's going to encourage malfeasance. And we don't need any more of that in science. But if you can't trust scientists to use promotional words in a judicious way, you can't really trust them to do anything else, can you? Because science it's all about trust. I mean, if you're gonna, maybe fibbing with language doesn't seem as bad as changing your data. But I think many scientists would feel that that's also inappropriate. Now, I would also say something else. Grants are really designed for aspirational ideas. It's give me money to see if I'm right about this stuff, okay? Promotional language in research papers, if your mind's going there, may be very different. There, promotional words could be interpreted as hype, could be interpreted as overstating your results, and then it's likely to backfire because you're setting expectations and other things that you just really can't get to, because the paper is not about give me the money to see if I'm right, but you're there to like proof of concept kind of thing. So I would say, that's a place where we need to go now to see how this language might be really affecting science. And I think in the reviewer's mind, he or she, whatever, was confounding those two things.
I see. Thanks for the insightful
Sure.
answer. I was probably a little facetious, but I think it is a serious concern, and thank you for the great answer.
Yeah, well, I know it's affected my in a grant that I'm doing right now, where I'm like, do I have enough in the beginning here to really engage the reader sufficiently? But also being careful not to overstate things. Yes?
Can you really claim that it's just the promotional words? Because you said that using the promotional words also correlates with actually having innovative results according to your index in the end. So I don't even know if I would file a grant with a lot of promotional words, even though it's clear that this is not going to have a big impact. I don't think that this is going to help me.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I enter the presentation that we gave.
Yeah, and I would, and that's how I feel about it. It really is reflecting something intrinsic about the grant's originality. Yes?
You showed at the beginning of that segment the meteoric rise of promotional words. And I'm curious whether the effect of the usage of promotional words is already if you can observe a decay already in their predictive power or their correlation? Because you showed us some margin plots for the study that you did, and I'm wondering if there's a way to sort of say something about how strong their impact has been over the years, and if we are already sort of seeing a decay, perhaps less anchoring on them by the reviewers.
So I can't answer that directly, we didn't do that, but we did put in fixed effects for year, which essentially says that the regression is, running a separate regression in the background for each year. Now, that only gets you partway towards your answer, because it could be that the effect was really strong in the beginning, is getting less strong as we go forward, but on average, it's still there across all the years. So that would be something else to look at. What we did look at, again, this had to do with, on the behest of the reviewers, was are promotional words simply becoming more and more and more common? And along with other things becoming simply more and more common. And we found that the promotional words really do stand out as changing in terms of language frequency more than other words on average. And then we did one other thing, I'm trying to remember what it was. I don't recall at the moment, but if it comes to mind, I'll let you know about the promotional words. I know I remember what it was. We went and we looked at a sample of NIH grant calls for grants. And we looked to see if promotional words were increasing in the calls. And what do you think we found? Yeah. So like you go back 20 years and you don't see words like, we're looking for breakthroughs. We want transformative research, like the stuff that we hear today, right? And so I think authors are also responding in terms of, to the grant, mirroring language that comes up in the grant, but also trying to do things that are more breakthrough oriented than they had been in the past. In the past, for instance, robustness of results had the highest frequency of related words. Today, it's really around innovativeness.
Is it that more clever researchers are also better salespeople? So for example, did you look at within person change of promotional words and then how that affected their winningness of grants?
So we didn't go quite that far, but we did look to see if you submitted a grant, because we don't know all their grants, right?
Yeah.
If you submitted a grant, it's say in year one in our observation, what was your percentage of promotional words? If you submit another grant, 3
Presumably
years
you're
later,
learning.
yeah, you're putting in more promotional words. Now, it could be that people's research is becoming more innovative with time too. Maybe not that they're just learning to use it more.
Mhm.
So, we didn't like dig into that particular thing as deep as probably you're interested in.
Okay.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you.